Good evening and welcome to the Faculty of Religious Studies of the University of St. Joseph. This evening we're going to present the first in a series of 7 lectures taking place over the next few months to mark the centenary of the apostolic letter of Pope Benedict XV on the propagation of the faith throughout the world, called after its first 2 words in the Latin text, Maximum Illud. Over the next few months, we'll look at the significance and impact of this letter in some detail. But tonight, it's my task to begin the series by setting the scene, trying to answer the most obvious questions. What was Maximum Illud, and should we care? Many of you know I'm Stephen Morgan, I'm the Dean of the Faculty, and I'm giving tonight's lecture. Other members of the faculty and some of our visiting academics will give the other talks in the series. Most of you have seen the poster, but I'll remind you about what they are at the end of the lecture. On the 30th of November 1919, Pope Benedict XV issued an apostolic letter addressed to the patriarchs, primates, bishops and archbishops of the Catholic Church throughout the world on the subject of the Church's missionary activity. This letter was widely seen at the time and has been regarded since as a pivotal document in the Church's reflection on the purpose, character, and approach to the task she received from her Lord whilst still on earth, when Christ commanded his disciples to go into the whole world and preach the gospel to all creation. This evening, I want to look at the historical context which provided Pope Benedict XV with the impetus for his letter and informed both what he said in it and what others have sought to make of it in the last 100 years. After doing that, I want to look in some detail at what the document actually says and the theology it contains, before some brief comments on the legacy of the document and a brief appraisal of its impact. And then finally, I want to make a few remarks looking to the future, both in terms of the Church's missionary activity and in terms of what my colleagues are going to talk about over the next few months. The small band of disciples, 11 men, Mary and a few other women remaining after Jesus Christ had ascended to his Father, understood themselves to have received a commission from the risen Christ to tell the remarkable story of their experience of his life, death, and resurrection, of his deeds and his words, of the message, the good news, the gospel that he'd preached. What is more, they believed that they'd been empowered by the Holy Spirit to do just that. This little group, the nascent church, conceived of itself and its purpose from the very beginning as missionary. In fact, at no point in her history has the Catholic Church ceased to seek to spread the good news of Jesus Christ to every land and people and nation. Even as a simply human phenomenon, the missionary activity of the Catholic Church must rank amongst the most remarkable of human achievements, insofar as it is a human achievement. Within 2 generations of the Ascension, there were Christian communities across the Roman Empire. And by the time that Christianity became officially tolerated, less than 300 years later, perhaps 1 in 3 people living in that empire was a Christian. The following 1,000 years saw Christianity grow from a tolerated minority to the predominant religion across Europe and the Middle East. And despite the eradication of its once vibrant North African presence by aggressive Islamic conquest, It was to be found down the eastern seaboard of that continent of Africa, and in pockets, some more long established than others, across the whole Eurasian landmass. It had survived fierce persecution and acrimonious internal division to utterly transform the civilization of those territories where it had managed to set down its roots. A small, well, at least by their own standards, heretical Jewish sect had become the default religion across some of the most populous and arguably prosperous regions of the world. The political, economic, and technological advances in Europe in the century after the Black Death changed utterly the story of that first 1,000 years of toleration. It changed the internal dynamics of a number of the most well-established kingdoms of the West. And the following period of growing economic prosperity and political consolidation had given Europeans a taste for the finer things in life: tastier food, richer fabrics, and the need for ever greater monetary liquidity. Extended land routes created high frictional costs related to transport, banditry, and cross-border customs duties. This provided the initial impetus for the huge European adventure that marked half a millennium, the so-called Age of Discovery. Advances in ship design meant that there was, by the middle of the 15th century, a genuine, quicker and cheaper alternative to the overland existing trade routes. It was therefore entirely predictable that those places with the strongest maritime cultures, first the Republic of Venice and then Portugal, England, Britain did not then exist as a political entity, Spain, and then later France and the Netherlands, would set to sea. They'd be at the forefront of this expansion, which was at first largely commercial, but soon, as new territories previously unknown to Europeans were discovered by them, if not by the people already living there, who hardly needed to be discovered. Those territories previously unknown to Europeans became as much about political and territorial control as about trade. Commerce became colonialism. It would be good, in fact essential now, I think, if we were to step back a little from our modern presuppositions about this age of exploration and colonialization. It's fair to say that presumptions fueled by Marxist political theory and the enormously influential historiography that has flowed from it, and in many ways came to dominate late 20th century views of colonialism, that these views risk distorting almost beyond recognition the motivations of those responsible for this massive project. In the light of that historiography, it's become a commonplace to assume the basest of economic and power-based impulses at the heart of the colonizers. Of course, we have to recognize that economic and political gain was a part of the picture, but they are by no means the whole picture, the whole story, and cannot on their own explain either the energy or the breadth of activity that accomplished European global expansion. During this era, and indeed for much of Christian history, the idea of the separation of politics and religion, of the church and the state, was alien to the idea Christians had of themselves and their society. The desire to transform society, to transform culture, to transform political structures in the light of Christian teaching, in the light of the event of Jesus Christ, was at the heart of the missionary activity of Christianity from even before that Constantinian settlement. It flowed from a belief that Christ was sovereign, and that it was the duty of all, from emperors and kings to the lowest of the low, to be subject to his rule. We know well the disputes about the relationship of secular and religious, especially papal, power in the medieval period, and the differing settlements to those disputes across different parts of Europe. What is not in doubt is that the notion of Christendom became more and more significant, and that it was indeed a significant motivating factor in both the range and character of all enterprises of medieval Europe, including the colonial enterprise. In Spain and Portugal, this took a particular form. Following the settlements of their disputes in Latin America by Alexander VI Borgia's bull of 1493, Inter Caetera, and the Treaty of Tordesillas the following year. Papal sanction for Portuguese and Spanish colonial expansion within defined geographic limits was given on the condition that they undertook specifically to spread the Catholic faith in those colonies. In response to the initial fervour with which they turned their hand to this task, Pope Clement VIII conceded unique powers to the kings of Portugal and Spain, whereby they were given de facto authority over both the government and the church in their respective mission territories. This system, padroado in Portuguese, padrão in Spanish, led to a close identification between narrowly national political and commercial interests and missionary activity. This de facto Erastian submission of church to state echoed in the character of the twin political and religious understanding underpinning colonial expansion of the other major player in the field, Protestant England. The close identification of national interest, whether defined in Lisbon, London, or Madrid, with missionary activity, was a distinctly mixed blessing. To be Christian in missionary territories meant, more or less, becoming politically and culturally Portuguese or Spanish or English. And in some ways, the success of the missions depended upon both the readiness of indigenous societies to accommodate these specifically Western European takes on Christianity. We should note that the Holy See quickly realized the dangers of this arrangement, and in an attempt to wrest back at least some of the control from the kings of Spain and Portugal, Gregory XV established the Congregation of Propaganda Fide in 1622, and through the establishment by his successor, Urban VIII, of the eponymous university, to provide for the influence and the formation of missionary clergy. The congregation, by the way, under its present name, the Congregation for the Evangelisation of the Peoples, whose prefect Fernando Cardinal Filoni visited us 3 weeks ago, still retains oversight of all the missionary territories of the world. He doesn't, at least now, have to deal with kings. A word of caution here, though, lest we see this as a purely Western European notion. The expansion of Islam in the 7th to the 15th century displayed similar characteristics of a united religious and political settlement. And Russia, the great power of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, at least after the fall of Constantinople in the face of Islamic expansion in 1453, spread its influence eastwards even to the borders of China and Japan, as it built a great continental empire, and with it brought Eastern Orthodoxy of a distinctly Russian flavour. To be a Christian in the Russian Empire was to be a Russian. It's in the nature of this exploration and colonial expansion that, like riding a bicycle, one either goes forward or falls off. European empires developed as the territories under colonial rule expanded. The journey from isolated trading outposts to enormous tracts of contiguous territory under the government of distant European authority was made inevitable by the desire to protect the wealth and influence of the colonizing nation. Even after the southern portion of Britain's North American empire threw off the colonial yoke at the end of the 18th century, and Spain's Latin American colonies rebelled more or less successfully in the first half of the 19th, the era of imperial expansion, understood as both economic and political advantage, and the spread of what were understood, at least by the colonizers, as civilizing cultural practices and saving religious belief, continued unabated as the vast territories of Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Australasia succumbed to European rule, although with distinctly mixed religious roots. India, like China and much of Southeast Asia, being largely immune to the religious aspects of this process. We must recognize that it's possible to color the growth of European empires as either black or white, when the motives of those involved were in fact rather more mixed, and the results similarly neither all good nor all bad, modern political prejudices aside. Injustices there were aplenty, and the legacy of notions of racial, cultural, and linguistic superiority can still be felt. If we must judge the motives and actions of earlier generations, however, we need a more varied palette of colours. Black and white, even shades of grey, don't serve either justice or a proper theological and cultural understanding of this history. To do so, to paint in black and white, to paint even in grayscale or even primary colours, runs the risk of both anachronism, the mistake of judging the past by the standards of the present, and a certain blindness to the faults of our own age. The most that can be said, I think, with any degree of certainty, is that for Christian missionary activity for most of the 400 or so years leading up to the First World War was tied up intimately with a distinct notion of Christendom and a desire, for reasons good and bad, to serve the commercial and political interests of the colonizing nations. That this led to too close an identification between the particular interests, character, and cultural particularities of those countries is undeniable. And even before the exhausting strife of the First World War, it had started to become apparent to anybody who looked. By the late 19th century, even the previously uncolonized interior of Africa experienced a wave of colonial and imperial expansion, such that by the end of the century, it was possible to travel from the mouth of the Nile in the north to the Cape of Good Hope in the south without ever leaving territories either directly ruled by or acknowledging the overlordship of the by now British Crown. The globe was almost entirely encircled by European empires or former colonies, and even China, its dynasty in its final weakness, was forced to acknowledge its powerlessness to resist European claims to trade and commercial influence, even the incursion of Christian missionaries. The very peculiar character of the religio-political settlement that ended 130 intermittent years of warfare in Central Europe following the Reformation had kept one major European language group largely out of all of this colonial enterprise. Until, in the face of industrialization and a dominant and militaristic Prussia, Germany, as we know it, emerged as a single country and emerged with ambitions to its own global empire. There were, however, few territories left. Small trading posts on the Chinese coast and unexploited territories in Southeast and Southwest Africa, unexploited because they offered, as a result of their particular geography, few commercial incentives, was about all that was left to the Germans. But emboldened by growing internal coherence, by a successful aggressive war with their neighbour France, a country weakened by almost a century of successive revolutions and restorations, and by a powerful combination of technological innovation, huge reserves of coal, and an alliance with neighbours to the south and east, neither strong enough to threaten it nor weak enough to be conquered, the economic might of the German Second Reich almost inevitably challenged itself into an attempt at colonial expansion and European troublemaking. This threat posed to Britain, to France and Russia, countries bound together by treaties promising military assistance in the face of aggression, boiled over in the hot summer of 1914. The war that resulted cost the lives of 18 million people, almost half of them civilians, with a further 20 million injured or missing. It was the first truly global conflict, and when in 1918 the Germans and their allies in Central Europe were forced to seek an armistice, such had been the cost and devastation, it was widely claimed that this had been a war to end all wars, a claim that was, within a generation, shown to be entirely without foundation, and for those of us 100 years later, something we might greet with a rather hollow laugh. As the trains hurtled towards the eastern and western fronts in the summer of 1914, the saintly successor of Peter, Pope Pius X, incidentally, the only pope ever to have been a parish priest, Pius X lay dying. The outbreak of hostilities on the 4th of August, my birthday, the outbreak of hostilities on the 4th of August, my birthday's got nothing to do with the outbreak of the First World War, but I just thought I'd make sure you had it in your diaries. The outbreak of hostilities on the 4th of August, already weakened by a heart attack the previous year, Pius fell into a deep sense of melancholy and died just over 2 weeks later, on the very day that German forces marched into Brussels and the king ran away. From the moment of his election, his successor, Benedict XV, was relentless in his calls for peace. The four major combatants of the Second World War didn't readily recognize the religious authority of the Pope. Protestant England and Prussia, Germany, secular, anti-clerical, Masonic France, and Orthodox Russia. And that they did not recognize his authority didn't help. And even the nominally Catholic Austria-Hungary had a 200-year tradition of resistance to papal pressure in both politics and religion. Although the succession of the Emperor Charles I and IV to the double monarchy in 1916 had the effect of weakening the commitment of Germany's major ally, and Charles, now a blessed, was anxious to do the right thing and call for peace. Benedict recognized the epoch-changing nature of this conflict, which he called the suicide of Europe, and he was alive to its immediate and long-lasting consequences for the Church and her missionary activity, which had been so closely tied up with the politics of these countries who had exhausted themselves on the fields of Flanders and just about anywhere else they met one another. 4 long years of war had left the major powers financially exhausted and called into question their moral standing too. These supposedly Christian nations had pursued their own self-interest at the expense of every principle that had hitherto governed military conflict between Christians. It was hard to characterize what took place in the First World War as a just war. That isn't to say that plenty of people didn't try. But for Benedict, if the Church's missionary activity wasn't to be stained by this moral bankruptcy of national self-interest, it was necessary to set out the perennial teaching of the Church concerning her mission to the peoples of the world in a manner that made clear once and for all that the command of the Lord to spread the good news of salvation could never be subordinated to the temporal interests of the nation state. As an aside, by the way, it's common to give the dates of the First World War as from 1914 to 1918. Although the treaty ending most of the fighting didn't come until the following year, and some of the peripheral conflicts carried on well into 1921. In truth, the settlement of the Treaty of Versailles was so punitive that it's widely recognized as having been a major cause of the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. But even the end of this conflict can be too conveniently tied to events in 1945, when in truth the war in Korea was a direct continuation of some of the conflicts of 39 to 45. And as we know, the state of war between North and South Korea still awaits a formal treaty ending it. If the First World War was the war to end all wars, perhaps it was because it was a war that ushered in a continued century of armed conflict. It was perhaps the war that never quite ended. But to return to Giacomo della Chiesa, Benedict XV. As the mud dried and the dust settled across the battlefields, the Pope, who had been tireless in his call for peace, put pen to paper. First, in an encyclical, Quod Iam Diu, of only 500 words, in which he both invited and commanded Catholics to spare no effort in working for lasting peace. And to the delegates of the peace conference, he issued a call to negotiate a peace that was based on justice. He implored the whole Catholic world to an effort of prayer. And then, in an apostolic letter, he set out the conditions under which the Church could pick up the banner of missionary activity once again. Now, and definitively, a project of the Church, a truly ecclesial project, and not one tied to the narrow interests of this kingdom or that republic. Not owing loyalty to, nor taking a specific form from this nation or that culture, but to and from the universal and unique missionary criterion of Jesus Christ and the salvation he accomplishes. I should, I think, say now something about language, since the world and the Church's documents, 100 years on from Maximum Illud, that apostolic letter, have adopted different standards from those employed by Benedict XV. The first thing to say is that, as I've already noted, with reference to Benedict's Quod Iam Diu, papal documents used to be examples of brevity, even of terseness. Modern papal encyclicals and other documents are, quite frankly, prolix, verbose. It's a trend that began at the Second Vatican Council, whose documents occupy more pages in the standard editions than the combined documents of the previous 20 ecumenical councils put together. And those of us who grew up under the papacy of Pope John Paul II thought, I think, that this trend had reached its summit, particularly when he was succeeded by a pope who was capable of combining profound theological reflection with a certain welcome and conciseness. Our beloved Holy Father Pope Francis appears to be, however, a return to the post-conciliar trend. Whatever other positives one might want to draw from his already extensive oeuvre, it's clear that he rarely says in 500 words what might be said in 5,000. If in looking at Maximum Illud you're expecting a lengthy disquisition setting out the entire socio-political and theological context for what the Pope wants to say, then Benedict XV is going to disappoint you. The document is just over 7,300 words in English, about 12 pages, and only 4,300 in the original and definitive Latin. You might compare that with the 46,500 words of Pope Francis's Evangelii Gaudium, and that's not counting the 217 footnotes. Maximum Illud has 14, and we're not even sure that they're real footnotes. They're merely references to the text in Scripture quoted in the main text. So it's short. The next thing to notice is that the vocabulary is very direct and reflects a rather less nuanced and sensitive tone of voice than that to which we've become used. For example, one is left in very little doubt that for Giacomo della Chiesa, evangelization meant proclaiming the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ with the intention that the recipient of the message should believe and be incorporated into the body of Christ, the visible bounds of which can be identified with the Catholic Church through baptism and sustained in the life of Christ through the sacraments. There is little or no allowance given in Maximum Illud for the good faith of non-Christians. And he doesn't mention non-Catholic Christians. It is as if they were not. Mission for him is the process by which proclamation is to be made. Modern notions of serving the community for the sake of serving it is absent. For Benedict, if you serve the community, if charity is your activity, it is directly at the service of conversion. And the notion of respectful dialogue doesn't get a look in. He uses expressions like pitiable sorrow at the condition of those who have not heard and yet embraced the gospel. And he refers to them as infidels with their blind and violent desires. Not expressions that we'd be likely to use too much today. This directness and a certain precision in the use of technical language makes Maximum Illud ring strangely in modern ears. If the documents of the magisterium are to be accepted as evidence, we're much more at ease today with less direct, less precise turns of phrase, seemingly preferring illustrative language to the prescriptive, exhortatory, and encouraging examples. Circumlocution we like, rather than full frontal assault. I make no apology for the length of this scene setting. It's impossible to understand the meaning and significance of a document and what it says if one does not have a secure hold on the historical context from which it emerged. Of necessity, the foregoing account of the history of the missions is painted with a very broad brush. Many nuances and details completely and consciously omitted. But that's because that introduction serves not as a lecture on the history of the missions, but as an introduction to the context of a document, an introduction to the impetus that brought Benedict XV to write Maximum Illud. We should give some time now, I think, to looking at the document itself, what it is, how it's structured, and what it says. Maximum Illud is often spoken of as the first of 5 missionary encyclicals, but in fact it isn't an encyclical at all. Rather, it's an apostolic letter. Although there's a technical difference in the form of the two, as far as the magisterial weight to be given to them, that is their teaching authority, the distinction between an apostolic letter sent to all the bishops of the world and an encyclical letter is, as our Dominican brothers would call it, a distinction without a difference. What's important is that Pope Benedict XV addressed his letter to the patriarchs, primates, archbishops, and bishops of the Catholic Church throughout the world. And so it falls to be considered to be part of the papal teaching in fulfillment of the Lord's command to Peter to confirm his faith, to confirm his brethren in the faith. Although not explicitly dogmatic and not concerning directly matters of faith and morals, Maximum Illud is otherwise possessed of the highest authority. It also makes certain practical recommendations and even provisions to meet the needs arising from those recommendations. And in different parts of it, speaks directly over the heads of the bishops to an ultimate audience, to missionary superiors, missionaries themselves, and indeed to the entire faithful. Pope Benedict opens his letter by recalling the command, which we heard at the beginning, to the Church, given by Christ in the final chapter of the Gospel of St. Mark. Go into the whole world and preach the gospel to all nations. And it notes that the apostles took up this mandate such that they went forth and reached everywhere. Benedict observes that this missionary call and response has been an unceasing constant in Christian history, and that this response is ordered always to the eternal salvation of the whole the whole human race. Maintaining his theme, Pope Benedict recalled those great missionaries who in the Church's history were the first missionaries to a number of traditionally Christian countries in Europe and the Middle East. It's an eclectic selection. England, France, and Ireland, England, Scotland, and Ireland get a mention. My beloved Wales doesn't. However, the apostle to Ireland, Patrick, was born in Wales. These great apostles of the gospel were responsible, Benedict notes, not simply for the conversion of individuals, but of entire peoples. Continuing his historical survey, admittedly, and you'll be glad to hear, much shorter than mine, Pope Benedict records the first missions to the Mongols and to China, not omitting to note that the initial successes didn't survive in the face of persecution. He records how, in the Americas, the missionary activity was intimately tied up with the fight for justice for the poor and the oppressed, and how the energy and ambition of these missionaries of the second millennium were exemplified in the luminous example of St. Francis Xavier. Bringing his remarks right up to date, well, right up to 1919, Benedict talks about the missions in Africa and Oceania and concludes with proper gratitude and pride by observing that anyone who studies the facts of this great saga cannot help being profoundly impressed by them, by all the stupendous hardships our missionaries have undergone in extending the faith, the magnificent devotion they've shown, and the overwhelming examples of intrepid endurance they have afforded us. Yet he adds a note of caution at the scale of the work yet to be accomplished. And to anyone, he says, who weighs these facts, the realization must come as a shock that right now there still remain in the world immense multitudes of people who dwell in darkness and the shadow of death. According to a recent estimate, he said, the number of non-believers in the world approximates to 1 billion souls. In the light of these observations, Pope Benedict XV says that the purpose of his letter is first to encourage the Church in its urgent and important missionary work, and second, to point out is the phrase he uses, to offer methods that you, the missionaries, can adopt to further the fulfillment of this monumentous undertaking. It serves two purposes. It's theoretical and it's intensely practical. Benedict then speaks over the head of the bishops to address the superiors of the missions, that is, of the missionary territories and congregations, and reminds them that they ought themselves to be the soul of the mission in their care, and should use every means they can to encourage and stimulate missionary activity. He sets for them a high bar. They're to be alert, efficient, filled with charity, deeply interested in everyone and everything, and to be models of pastoral concern for all. For Benedict, the success of each and every mission depends upon the personal commitment, missionary zeal, and organizational capacity of these very individuals, these missionary superiors. They are critical to the mission. Above all else, the personal concern of everyone charged with the responsibility for missionary activity, but specifically, perforce, for the superiors of missionary territories and congregations, their primary concern, to which every other activity must be ordered, is, he says, and I quote, the eternal salvation of every person living there. He scolds them for resting on their laurels when they've converted a few thousand people, when there are millions yet to be converted. And this will only be achieved, this conversion of whole peoples, he argues, by energy, organization, and a spirit of charity that makes for the widest collaboration. But he warns that even if one is working tirelessly and single-mindedly for the glory of God and the salvation of souls, even this can be imperiled by a certain possessiveness. To be truly effective, he says, it's important not to treat the mission territory and the missionary activities in it as if it was a personal fiefdom. It is rather something entrusted to the individual, who is always to remember that it is the Lord's vineyard. Here, Pope Benedict sounds his first warning about the close identification of the national interest of individuals and that of their own missions, and is clearly alive to the fact that religious orders can be remarkably resistant to the idea that they might work with members of other religious orders. For these missionary endeavours to succeed, the Pope pointed out that the recruitment and formation of local clergy, members of the races and peoples to whom the missions were directed, offer the greatest hope for the new churches. This is where, to use an American expression, the rubber hits the road in maximum illud. Benedict writes, for the local priest, one with his people by birth, by nature, by his sympathies and his aspirations, is remarkably effective in appealing to their mentality and thus attracting them to the faith. Far better than anyone else, he knows the kind of argument they will listen to, and as a result, he often has easy access to places where a foreign priest would not be tolerated. And Benedict makes it clear that in their training and deployment, these local missionaries were not to be seen or treated in any way as second-class citizens. As he put it, on the contrary, they must take up God's work as equals so that someday they will be able to enter upon the spiritual leadership of their peoples. The church was, in Papa della Chiesa's mind, not an intruder in any country, nor, he said, is she alien to any people. If one wanted to see the seed, the remote cause of the debates about cultural specificity, inculturation, and syncretism that have so occupied those engaged in the oversight of the missions and in the development of the theology of missions in the wake of the Second Vatican Council decree Ad Gentes, then one could do worse than to reflect upon what Pope Benedict XV had to say 100 years ago. In many ways, it was this call that represented Pope Benedict XV's truly radical contribution to the Church's approach to mission, and one which, as we will hear in subsequent lectures, was the most difficult to fulfill. Indeed, you'll hear in the coming months of the reluctance to establish seminaries for indigenous clergy. You'll hear of a refusal to ordain them or deploy them, or, quite frankly, attitudes that cross the line from a patronizing paternalism into outright racism. It wasn't, however, all bad news. Perhaps the most successful example of hearing Benedict's call for an indigenization and highly trained local clergy and accepting that challenge, albeit 30 years later, was to be found in sub-Saharan Africa, in the missions of the Holy Ghost Fathers, now known as the Spiritans, who became especially active in identifying promising young African vocations and giving them serious priority in formation and responsibility. Their seminary in Gabon, West Africa, was a regular source of supply for the Roman universities, and when Marcel Lefebvre was made apostolic delegate for French-speaking West Africa immediately after the Second World War, he saw to it that only native African clergy were selected as bishops, earning him the enmity of a number of his fellow white missionaries, but a shining legacy and reputation in that region that hasn't even been eclipsed by his later controversial positions and actions. Benedict XV then moves his attention to and addresses the missionaries themselves. Having spoken to the bishops and their superiors, he now speaks to the missionaries. In reminding them of the true goal of mission, he once again warns against mistaking the interests of their own nations for those of God. In strikingly direct terms worth quoting in extenso, he writes, "Remember that your duty is not to the extension of a human realm, but of Christ's. And remember, too, that your goal is the acquisition of citizens for a heavenly fatherland, not for an earthly one. It would be tragic indeed if any one of our missionaries forgot the dignity of their office so completely as to busy themselves with the interests of their terrestrial homeland instead of those of their homeland in heaven. It would be a tragedy indeed if an apostolic man were to spend himself in attempts to increase and exalt the prestige of the native land he once left behind him. Such behavior would affect his apostolate like a plague. It would destroy him, the representative of the gospel, the sinews of his love for souls, and it would destroy his reputation with the populace. For no matter how wild and barbarous a people," he must have been to Wales, "for no matter how wild and barbarous a people, they are well aware of what the missionary is doing in their country and what he wants from them or for them. They will be subject to him in their own way. They will subject him in their own way to a very searching investigation. And if he has any other object in view than their spiritual good, they'll find out about it. Suppose it becomes clear that he's involved in worldly schemes of some kind, and that instead of devoting himself exclusively to the work of the apostolate, he's serving the interests of his homeland as well. The people immediately will suspect everything he does. And in addition, such a situation could easily give rise to the conviction that the Christian religion is the national religion of some foreign people, and that anyone converted to it is abandoning his loyalty to his own people and submitting to the pretensions and domination of a foreign power. Sound familiar? He goes on, we've been deeply saddened by some recent accounts of missionary life, accounts that displayed more zeal for the profit of some particular nation than for the growth of the kingdom of God. We've been astonished at the indifference of their authors to the amount of hostility these works stir up in the minds of believers. This is not the way of the Christian missionary, not if he's worthy of the name. No, the true missionary is always aware that he is not working as an agent of his country, but as an ambassador of Christ. And his conduct is such that it is perfectly obvious to anyone watching him that he represents a faith that is alien to no nation on earth, since it embraces all men who worship God in spirit and in truth, a faith in which there is no Gentile, no Jew, no circumcised, no uncircumcised, no barbarian, no Scythian, no slave, no free man. But Christ is everything in each of us. Popes scarcely ever speak more directly. In the remaining paragraphs addressed to the missionaries, he encourages them to work selflessly and to keep in mind that it's the glory of God that the missionary himself seeks, not personal profit. He reminds them that their training has to be thorough, even to the level of asserting the absolute requirement that missionaries acquire a true proficiency, a fluency in the languages of the people to whom they take the gospel, in order that real trust can be established and the truths of the faith can be communicated completely and convincingly. It's fair to say that this has been taken more or less seriously, although the fact that a Welshman is giving a lecture in a former Portuguese-administered territory in China in the medium of English suggests that there still may be some way to go. I did think of writing this in Welsh. Important as these attributes are, Pope Benedict XV places one attribute above all others. It's an attribute that he calls indispensable and of the most critical importance: holiness. Without this sanctity of life, he says, all the proficiency and training, all the other skills and characteristics will be as naught. Hear this. Give the missionary, he says, if you will, every imaginable talent of mind and intellect. Endow him with the most extensive learning and the most brilliant culture. Unless these qualities are accompanied by moral integrity, they will be of little or no value in the apostolate. On the contrary, they can be the cause of disaster, both to the missionary himself and to others. The model is, of course, the Lord. The Lord himself, who Benedict recalls, burns with charity towards even the most abandoned unbeliever, for whom too Christ shed his blood. Before ending his remarks to the missionaries, Benedict made special mention of the missionary work of religious sisters. We should note that there were then, and are now, almost twice as many religious sisters in the world as there are priests and religious brothers. But their work is, as was, often underappreciated. It is unthinkable today that this work would go unremarked in a papal document, but in 1919, that the Pope would make special mention of it was remarkable. I should add here perhaps a small anecdote. In the Anglophone part of Cameroon in West Africa is a diocese twinned with my own diocese of Portsmouth. In the wake of Maximum Illud, the Congregation of the Sisters of Christian Instruction, in gratitude for Benedict XV's mention, named a school the Pope Benedict XV High School. When I visited it in 2012, it had acquired another number. It was now the Pope Benedict XVI high school. I don't imagine that Papa della Chiesa was much bothered, and I don't suppose Papa Ratzinger was too impressed, but it amused me. When Pope Francis said in Evangelii Gaudium that he dreamed of a missionary church, this was hailed as a new departure. His breathless acolytes in the so-called Catholic press made much of the fact that this Pope from the global south recognized what his predecessors had not, that the church is missionary or she's nothing. The fact that the Second Vatican Council's 1965 decree Ad Gentes on the missionary activity of the church makes precisely the same point, as do both Paul VI and John Paul II in their own encyclicals, appeared to be lost on these individuals. I think sometimes in our desire to show our devotion to the present Holy Father, we're inclined to, in the English idiom, over-egg the pudding. We've already seen that Benedict XV made exactly this point, that the church is either missionary or she is nothing, at the beginning of Maximum Illud. And in the last section of the letter, he gives practical ways in which all the faithful can participate in this constitutive mission. Through the apostleship of prayer, through the fostering of vocations, and through economic assistance. In this Lenten season, we might note the parallels with the traditional weapons of the church, recalled in the collect of last Sunday's Mass: prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Benedict also called on all Catholics to participate in the Missio Ad Gentes by cooperating in the work of the Society for the Propagation of Faith, the Association of the Holy Childhood, and for a new organisation he established to coordinate and encourage missionary zeal in Catholic countries, the Missionary Union of the Clergy. Ending the apostolic letter by echoing the call of the Lord to the fishermen in Luke 5 to put out into the deep, Pope Benedict XV committed the entire missionary activity of the Church to the heavenly patronage of Mary under the title Queen of the Apostles. What then can we say about the significance of Maximum Illud? This is the "and should we care" part of the title of the talk, but I promise it won't take as long as the first part. This "and should we care" question, what I say to my students is the sensible "so what?" It's the response that we ought to have to anything we learn, anything we're taught. In this, I'll be brief because many of the subsequent talks are going to cover plenty of the reasons why we should care. But there are, I think, a couple of things that can usefully be said at this point. First, about the theology of mission embodied in the apostolic letter, and then about its legacy. The theology of mission set forth in Maximum Illud has about its 6 aspects worthy of our consideration, and I'm just going to name them. The first is a Christ-centered ambition for the salvation of souls. The second is that it is a theology of organized mission, proper ecclesially directed mission, a mission of the church, not one riding on the coattails of national interest. Third, it's collaborative. Mission is not my thing or your thing, it's our thing. It's indigenous because it is a missio ad gentes. It's a mission to peoples, and the best missionaries to peoples are those peoples themselves. It's eschatological. That is, it's ordered to the completion of all things in Christ. And it's a universal responsibility. That characterizes the theology of Maximum Illud. The legacy is perhaps more difficult to summarize. I've mentioned several times the Second Vatican Council's document, its decree Ad Gentes of 1965. There have also been a series of missionary encyclicals and other provisions, all of which, more or less, can be traced both in their conception and their outlines to Benedict XV's original view. How's it going? How's this Missio ad Gentes going? How's this missionary activity going? Now, statistical evidence is often not terribly helpful, but it does at least give us some sort of context. We noted that Benedict was aware that maybe 1 billion people had not heard the gospel in 1919. In 1900, the world's population was 1.5 billion, and the Catholic population of the world was 266 million, give or take. 17.8% of the world's population. In 2015, the world's population was 7 billion, and the Catholic population, more or less, 1.2 billion. Who's good at maths? 17.1%. Doesn't look like we're doing too well. This missionary century may have made a very large number of people Christian, but it hasn't kept up with the very large number of people that God has made. It's a mixed picture. Massive growth in Africa and Asia, steep decline in Europe and the Americas. In Africa, there were only 2 million Catholics in 1900, 1.7% of the population. In 2015, that had risen to just under 200 million, or 15.6% of the population. The growth in Asia has been somewhat similar, even though some territories, notably India and China, have, for all kinds of reasons, socio-political, cultural, religious, and the like, been difficult missionary nuts to crack, as some of you know a great deal better than I do. In Europe, falling birth rates and practice rates have meant that the church is in steep decline. Practice rates in Europe are highest in Poland. About 65% of Catholics go to Mass in Poland every week. And lowest in Belgium, where only 1 Catholic in 20 goes to Mass weekly, and scarcely 1 in 10 more than a couple of times a year. Think of this. In most of Northern Europe, only 2% of Catholics under the age of 30 go to Mass more than once a month. The picture in Latin America is scarcely any better. In Honduras, in 1990, the Catholic population was 80% of the population. It's now 37% of the population. In the face of Protestant proselytization. We have some questions to ask ourselves over the next few weeks about the legacy of Maximum Illud, and about perhaps the specifically European legacy of the last 500 years of mission. First, does successful mission tend towards the nature of Christendom? Well, not necessarily, I think, and we might see how that works out in some places. But I think, because it is a missio ad gentes, the missionary activity of the church does involve the transformation not just of individuals, but of whole peoples and their cultures. We have to give some thought to religious pluralism, and as I've put it, following the Holy Father's document in Abu Dhabi, the permissive will of God. We should never forget that the story of the Tower of Babel is not a sign of blessing. And we need to think about the interaction between the new evangelization of formerly predominantly Christian countries, and we might now reasonably include Latin America in that, with the missio ad gentes to people who have yet to hear the gospel. And that, of course, here naturally focuses us on China. Over the next few months, we're going to think about the theological context of the mission to the peoples, the Missio ad Gentes. Next month, Professor Arnold Manera is going to talk to us about specifically the call in the Gospel of St. Matthew, remembering always that sacred scripture is to be the soul of our theology as much in our consideration of missionary activity as anything else. Returning from Portugal at the beginning of May, Professor Eleuterio is going to talk to us about the missions and the Catholicity of the Church. Father Edmund Day is going to talk to us about dialogue and proclamation in the context of the three teachings of China, as we start to focus a little bit on some particularities, but keeping it still at a theological and a philosophical level. And then in the final three lectures, we're going to look at some concrete examples. We're going to look, in a lecture given by Professor Gassner, at the challenge of forming missionary clergy, the resistance to the very idea of forming indigenous clergy. Father Cyril Law is going to talk to us about the process of the resisting of enculturation of Christianity in China. And finally, the rector is going to talk to us, the rector of the university, Father Peter Stilwell, is going to talk to us about the place of Catholic education in the Missio ad Gentes, and specifically the role of a Catholic university. In the posters, I promised you a Chinese translation of what I had said and what everybody said immediately afterwards. Since I actually only finished this lecture at about 25 to 8, you'll have to come next month, but there will, I promise, for those of you who will benefit from it, be Chinese text available. I've gone on far too long. You might have questions, you might just want to run away, but thank you very much for listening.